Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the IMPA Events Week once more. This morning, I'm delighted to introduce you to IMPA's Head of Projects, Strategy and Development, Jasmine, who's going to run this very important IMPA ACT session. IMPA ACT for our organization is incredibly important. It's the founding pillar within the 5-pillar program around sustainability. And we will have, I think, a very interesting session today exploring what's been happening around responsible supply chain management and discussing it with the program's architect. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jasmine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's core session from the IMPA team. I hope you're enjoying the IMPA Virtual Events Week so far, and that everyone has networked, learned, and debated aplenty so far. Now, today's core session is all about responsible supply chain management and why responsible business conduct is no longer optional, but a requirement for companies to thrive. As you all know, back at the IMPA office, we run our IMPA ACT program, and this was back in 2013, the first management system in the world to create custom standardization on responsible business conduct in the global shipping industry. The program is fully aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and the OECD guidelines. And through it, we help ship owners, ship managers, and ship suppliers understand how to regularly assess their social, environmental, and economic risks, and how to develop policy commitments and remediation mechanisms. It is a program for companies that care about people, about the planet that we all share, and about profit, and we are immensely proud to now have more than 100 companies engaged so far with IMPA ACT. As you know, we also run a certification scheme through the program and offer the industry free access to a public database of sustainable maritime suppliers who are working with our IMPA ACT program. Now, today, I am even prouder because Stephen and I have a truly special guest, albeit in a virtual environment, but it is truly special guest. As you can imagine, IMPA ACT did not come to fruition out of nowhere. There was a mighty force at play there, and today I'm very happy to be joined by Sune. I will stick with Sune. I'll try to say the last two names. So Sune Skadegaard Thorsen, the architect behind this fantastic program. I call him a wizard in all things CSR. He's a dear friend of IMPA as well, and he's the CEO and founder of Copenhagen-based Global CSR. Sune is a true icon in the sustainability field and has been pushing companies to walk the sustainability walk for more than 2 decades. And he's here today to talk to us and answer a lot of questions, I hope, about responsible business conduct, latest developments in the field of CSR, and why being a responsible business is no longer an option. I know I have spent the last few days collecting several questions from our members to Sune, mostly regarding, of course, the upcoming regulations imposed at EU levels, and I am sure many people attending today have additional questions for you, Sune. So without further ado, Sune, if I can please ask you to perhaps introduce yourself, what you do, and how and whom you help from one of the leading CSR consultancy firms back in Copenhagen.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for the very nice introduction. And it is indeed a long travel that we have taken upon ourselves since IMPA ACT was started in 2013. My company, or my work in sustainability started already back in the mid-90s, in 1996, when I shifted from being an international corporate lawyer into corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, as we would name it on continental Europe, in continental Europe. And my big worry at those times when I saw corporate social responsibility as a term come up in the UK primarily was that it was focused around this stakeholder notion only. And I was really wondering why international principles for sustainable development, as put forward by the states, being human rights, environment, anti-corruption, were not part of the discourse at that time. So that became, so to say, my purpose with the opening a consultancy back in 1998 and starting to advising companies on how to apply these international principles for sustainable development. And at that time, of course, there were no standards. With the UN Global Compact in 2000, the first goal was to say reached, that at least now there was a pressure or an invitation from the UN to align both strategies and practices with international principles for sustainable development, but it was all voluntary. And we all know how business react to voluntary initiatives, that we have a few front runners that really seek out to apply this in their businesses, but most businesses just keep it as a nice to have and not a need to have. I think what has happened since 2000 is that Global Compact actually paved the way for quite a few companies starting to engaging with these international principles. But the major shift only came in 2005 when Professor John Ruggie was named the special representative of the UN General Secretary, and he then he's a brilliant political scientist from Harvard University, and he had now 6 years to devote himself to develop what should it mean for business to respect human rights. We all knew that, I mean, no business would say that they don't respect human rights, but what does it actually mean? And I think the quite ingenious stroke with the UN guiding principles put that nicely together and defined corporate respect for human rights, similar to what we've been working with businesses on. And I was in close contact with John all through his 6 years in office. But defining it as a management process, similar to the management processes we knew from managing risks of adverse impacts in the environmental area, and due diligence as it was put forward as a requirement to get a reduction in your penalty from the UK Bribery Act, for example. So basically he tied the knots of sustainability well together in terms of what is the minimum we could expect from any company. With the UN guiding principles on business and human rights from 2011. Now, the guiding principles didn't spell out very clearly, and do not spell out very clearly, how does this affect our activities in responsible supply chain management. And so we asked the Danish government whether we could assist them and the ship owners industry to explore that further. And we were lucky that John Ruggie managed to look at the final report, and we that came out in early 2013. And with the ship owners industry coming in, and in particular the two ship owners, Danish ship owners, J. Lauritsen and Norton, we managed to describe what would be the minimum we could expect from any company vis-a-vis its suppliers. And with that, with John Ruggie's review of that work, we were able to then invite IMPA Stephen in and request Stephen to spearhead the first initiative in the world on responsible supply chain management aligned with the UN guiding principles. And as we all know, the OECD guidelines at the same time took in word by word the UN guiding principles into the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and cleverly applied the same management process to adverse impacts on the environment and in relation to anti-corruption, the subject areas covered by the OECD guidelines. So with that, I think IMPA took a brave step forward. The approach that is enabled by a global minimum standard for responsible business conduct needs also to show its value in practice. And I think that IMPA ACT is, as the first industry initiative applying the UN Guiding Principles OECD guidelines, has done a tremendous work. It's difficult because it's different from old approaches, and the standard put up level playing field for responsible business conduct that is actually pretty high. So it's still seen as relatively niche for businesses to meet that standard as it's written, to have a policy commitment that fulfill the basic requirements from the Guiding Principles OECD guidelines, and not least to conduct regular impact assessments on human rights, the environment, and anti-corruption operational level as required by the standard. But at least now there's a go-to for the ship owners industry. There's the IMPA ACT that manages to give that, so to say, advice to their members on what does it actually mean to meet the minimum standard for responsible business conduct. We will hopefully, and quite certain from, see that Pillar 1 in the UN Guiding Principles that relates to the state duty to protect people from human rights impacts of businesses actually requires states to regulate companies within their jurisdiction to respect human rights, i.e. to do the human rights due diligence. But it has taken 10 years, a little more, when the EU next year will start regulating businesses within the EU to meet the minimum standard. It's something that all states in the world have agreed to do. And of course, it will help a lot with having businesses implement these management processes when it becomes a legal requirement with some kind of consequences behind it if they don't. But of course, we could expect from any company in the world to respect human rights. That's the minimum, to deal with human dignity, basically. And similar with the environment, and we all know what's happening with the climate change. So, of course, all businesses should relate to their environmental impacts and describe, be transparent about how they manage those risks of adverse impacts also on the environment. And we know that economic sustainability is completely dependent on the eradication of corruption. So companies, of course, would also need to deal with that risk in a transparent manner. So basically, that's the trip. It's been wonderful to work with you guys in the UK. In Denmark, of course, we have continued. We do advise the EU Commission from time to time, but our primary clients are, of course, businesses. And our focus as a small boutique shop, basically, is, of course, to select the clients that we can see as becoming best practices in the world. Because we need to go the step further. We need to demonstrate in practice, how do you document human rights due diligence? How do you document environmental due diligence? How do you document economic due diligence? And we need businesses to be brave enough to stand forward and say, this is my impact assessment. I'm now transparent about how I manage my risks of adverse impacts. And we need that information to come forward so that we can scale up respect for human rights, not only within the EU, but of course, globally.
I think you provided an absolutely fantastic background to global CSR, to even responsible supply chain management a little bit. IMPA ACT, to our work so far. So I think that's a brilliant introduction from you, Sune. But tell us in practice, for our attendees today who are coming unequipped with the right sustainability tools yet. So what does this responsible business conduct look like today for a shipping company in order for their business practice to be aligned with the UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines? And tell us an example. How does this look in practice?
Well, it's the first thing businesses have to appreciate, and that also accounts for the ship owners industry, of course, is that establishing a management process where a company in all its operational level units respects human rights is a long process. It takes time. It's not done tomorrow. You will not be able to. It's an forever ongoing exercise to conduct due diligence, and we only started the route. So it's important to cut down the elephant in small parts, and then train, build capacity within the company to be able to appreciate and understand what the requirement is, and actually to conduct the actual impact assessments themselves, so that they do not have to hire in consultants like us or others to do that work. That will never enable them to become or to demonstrate responsible business conduct forever, which is what is, of course, expected by any company. So the first thing is a little humility and ice in the stomach. It will over time evolve as a business culture once you start making operational these due diligence processes. Now, it's for a ship owner. You operate a lot of ships internationally, possibly if you're one of the largest ship owners. So, and there may be adverse impacts, risks of adverse impacts on human rights in all those ships, basically. So, should we then conduct regular human rights impact assessments at all our ships? That is a major task when you start out. So, start out with one or two units that are representative of your business, and conduct the human rights impact assessments there, share them with your employees and with other impacted stakeholders, and then you can start slowly over the years to roll it out in your company to become, so to say, the standard operating practice. And mind you, most ship owners are already managing key elements of their risks, like health and safety. And there's probably not a ship owner today that are not also concerned about the right to participate in cultural life for the people that are working on the ships. You know, they are mandated already by some of the key standards to have available literature and film and access to the internet. So all these elements that they are used to work with are actually part of human rights due diligence, being able to describe what they're doing to prevent and mitigate these risks. And they are managing many of these risks already. They just need to get, so to say, the view, the perspective from a human rights lens to what they're already doing, and then fill out the holes where they did not manage the risks that they would identify yet. I hope that gave you a little
Yes, for sure. And I think even with environmental risks, I think, you know, one of the questions we ask at IMPA ACT is, are you ISO certified in environment? And oftentimes that ticks quite a few boxes in the environmental risks field. So yeah, I think many companies are doing a lot of what's required already. They just need to get the holistic view that you were talking about and know exactly how to put together the puzzle.
Yeah, and become transparent about it. That's the key issue here. How can they document that they actually revisited their business practices in light of the core elements of human dignity, namely human rights and labor rights, the core elements of the environment, and the core elements of economic risks. So that's basically the requirement today, that we should be able to disclose our regular impact assessments to our business relationships. And I mean, IMPA ACT is formulated as a supply chain management approach. So we look at suppliers to the ship owners industry, and of course, we would expect all suppliers in the ship owners industry to be able to meet the standard as well. One has to remember, when we point one finger to our supplier, four fingers points back. So definitely we should also be able to meet the standard ourselves. And the big advantage in doing a good job in meeting the standard and becoming transparent about your impacts and how you manage them and how you measure effectiveness on that, is that you can share that information with your business relationship, i.e. your supplier, so that they can become inspired on how to give you, or being able to provide you with the same information or similar information, but for their context and from what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's step one of the IMPACT program. Always look at your own operations first before you start pinpointing to your suppliers and your partners. Always look at yourself first, and then be able to share that experience with everyone else whom you have expectations from, say.
Yeah. All your business relationships, basically. And you may look into your customer side as well. The responsibility is the same. You're responsible for adverse impacts in your full value chain according to the standard. The big challenge with reading the UN Guiding Principles or ST guidelines is, how do we then apply the notion that we now have a minimum standard into a reasonable expectation for businesses? And since it's a global standard, and so it was vital that the UN came up with this standard. Since it is a global standard, it's a reasonable expectation for any company in the world. All states have agreed to this standard.
And do you think IMPA ACT can help those companies without a CSR person, the designated CSR person at the moment? Because we can see an increasing number of companies letting go of their CSR-focused department or CSR people, and procurement taking over, and them being the main department focusing on this responsible supply chain management. So do we see programs like IMPA ACT helping these companies and being a good first stepping stone for them into this area?
Definitely, and it's not necessary to have, so say, a dedicated CSR person or department. Often with the companies we work for, they will build the capacity with people who are in charge of quality, who are in charge of HR, and so develop, so to say, the capacity to understand due diligence with existing employees. And so basically, it's not rocket science when you've done it. The big thing is to do it. Just do it, and make sure that you have a few people within your company that get the point and are in charge of that management system. So of course you need to dedicate resources in-house to become a responsible business. And on the other hand, this will pay you back manifold when you meet requests from your customers, and when you want to put yourself forward as a responsible company, which will be more and more necessary, especially when it becomes mandatory in the EU. It will be hard to do business with European businesses if you do not meet this minimum standard. It has already become part of the investment regime in EU. So we already have regulation in place for sustainable investment, and the UN Guiding Principles OSD guidelines is put forward in the EU taxonomy as the minimum safeguard for sustainable investment. So now nobody from next year, when the taxonomy starts working, no investor can call themselves sustainable without ensuring that the companies they invest in meet the minimum standard for responsible business conduct.
It's very interesting. And I'm going to ask this: how does how do the Sustainable Development Goals, how do philanthropic gestures, how does the UN Global Compact and the 10 principles tie in with all this? Do companies who, for instance, use their contributions to furthering one or more of the SDGs, can they show that particular gesture as an example that they are also fulfilling their corporate responsibility?
No.
No.
Short answer. But it's interesting how the SDGs, especially in Scandinavian countries, I believe, has taken over from the agenda of responsible business conduct as well. The Sustainable Development Goals represent what the states agreed to measure themselves upon in terms of sustainable development for the period 2015 to 2013. So companies, please stay aware that in 2013 there will be no more Sustainable Development Goals. There will be some new goals with a new name coming from 2030 until 2045, similar to the Millennium Development Goals that we had from 2000 until 2015, the first time that the international community started to measure on sustainable development. But the 17 goals and the 169 targets only represent selected elements of the international principles for social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and economic sustainability, namely those elements that the states could agree to measure themselves upon. Now, since as a company, according to the standard, you have to relate to risks of adverse impacts on the full range of social sustainability, all the elements of social sustainability, all the elements of environmental sustainability, all the elements of economic sustainability, it's not enough to just address the SDGs. So responsible business conduct is the base that all businesses need to apply. They need to look at the full range of risks of impacts on sustainability. And the SDGs come in handy as a company if you want to work with what we would call strategic CSR, or creating shared value, as Porter and Kramer would put it forward, where you want to make a specific difference in the world. Then you may look at the SDGs and say, well, I as a company want to contribute to the fulfillment of this, or goal 3 or goal 7, because that falls within my interest as a company to further that particular sustainable development goal, or I'm born with a business that automatically feeds in to that goal. But so strategic CSR, where you go beyond, where you start contributing to sustainable development, so say is where companies for the future, let's say in 10 years, when every company in the world have in place the basic management system, when you then want to compete on sustainability against your peers, then you would start competing on being best at contributing to the fulfillment of sustainable development. That's strategic CSR. And the SDGs are merely relevant in that respect.
I think you had a brilliant article recently published on the Global CSR website, which I will definitely link to the session on this, where you were saying focus on the basis of the pyramid and then go upwards to other things. It's always important to focus on the main elements.
Yeah, and there's another issue at stake here. So of course, if it falls natural for your company to contribute to the elements that are mentioned by the SDGs, there's added value because you know that the states are also measuring themselves and are putting both resources and attention to those specific areas. But it may well be that your company does not inherently or naturally want to contribute to the fulfillment of any of the sustainable development goals, but would rather see them as contributing to one of the elements that were not chosen to be part of the sustainable development goals. Other elements of sustainable development that you have to look at potential adverse impacts against, so you would be aware of them, and could you then turn those to strategic objectives if they're not part of the SDGs? And of course, you should be allowed to do that as a company, so your strategic opportunities are wider than the SDGs. Don't forget that. And as long as you stick to the core elements of sustainable development, all the human rights, including the labor rights, all areas of environmental sustainability, all areas of economic sustainability for your strategic purpose, then that strategic objective can you can maintain that also beyond 2030. So you don't have to change your strategy or your strategic objectives in 2030 when some new goals will be presented to the world community.
Right, clear. So no philanthropic gestures, no furthering the SDGs before you take care of the basics. Basics being, do your regular due diligence, make sure you have remediation systems and mechanisms in place, and have a policy commitment.
Exactly.
Fine, so let's start addressing, finally, I think it's time, the issue that is currently shaking the CSR and procurement departments of many EU companies. And as I said to you, I think just before the session, this is truly the best of times and the worst of times. And you know, the Commission, for everyone watching, is planning to make human rights and environmental due diligence mandatory for companies based in the EU from next year. Now, the European Parliament's Committee on Legal Affairs have even published a draft report recently, just last month, which includes the text of the proposed directive. Now, of course, for those companies that have been actively involved with initiatives like IMPA ACT and that have been working on alignment with the UNGPs and OECD guidelines, this change may not be truly impactful or worrisome in many ways. Now, for all the other companies that haven't been doing so, it will represent a huge challenge. Sune, what do we know so far? And here I have, I think, 10 questions. What do we know so far? How mandatory is mandatory? And how will companies comply when having, for instance, divisions or external managers outside the EU? What challenges do you foresee? What recommendations do you have for companies falling within the scope of the directive? And wait, I'm not finished. What can EU companies do now to be better equipped for when enactment comes?
Last things first.
What do we know so far?
What do we know so far? We don't know much. We've seen the proposal from the legal committee of the Parliament for a directive, and I'm putting together our comments to that right now. We are a little worried in some aspects. I think there's a tendency for European politicians and for European, also some European companies to appreciate or to see human rights due diligence as only relevant for activities out there, outside the EU. The guiding principles in this respect are very clear. All companies, no matter where they operate, have risks of adverse impacts on human rights. So therefore, we need to conduct this due diligence also in our European divisions. But there has been a long tradition from EU companies and EU in politics that one would not appreciate the need to do due diligence because we have a perception that our level of legislation is well in terms of protecting human rights. That's the guiding principles are very clear in this area, that human rights due diligence is distinct from legal compliance. It doesn't matter what your state does, you still need to conduct human rights due diligence. So we need somehow to get the or provide input so that EU politicians do not see human rights due diligence as only relevant in remote areas in the world from the EU, and only for companies down the chain, the value chains of companies. That's the first thing, so that we appreciate that EU legislation should first and foremost require EU companies to conduct due diligence for themselves. Where are they at risk of causing or contributing to adverse impacts through their own operations? That must be the so to say, primary goal. When they then relate in the narrative that we also see from this proposal from the Parliament, when they relate to how to deal with your supply chain, which is the long way, they put forward the notion that you should do due diligence on your suppliers, meaning that I should go to a supplier and I should identify their risks of adverse impacts, and I should do something to better mitigate those risks. And that's, of course, a mission impossible. We cannot do that. So the way you constructed impact is that you require, of course, your business relationships to meet the minimum standard, i.e. that they will conduct their own due diligence and share the results with you. As part of that minimum requirement, they will have to ask their next, so say, level of their suppliers or their business relationships to do the same. And then with time, we get the transparency also throughout the chain. So the notion that we've seen mentioning in some of these documents, that you should somehow disclose to the world or in the name of corporate responsibility who all your suppliers are, and your not only your first tier suppliers but your full value chain, is not warranted by the guiding principles of the OECD guidelines. And we have to so say somehow make sure that initiatives like IMPA ACT and ourselves and others make sure to make clear to the European Commission that a requirement for businesses to disclose in public who their suppliers are will eventually eradicate small, medium-sized businesses all over Europe. If small companies were to disclose who their suppliers are in the name of responsible business conduct, then they would be out of business very soon, because their larger competitors would easily disrupt their business or take over those key suppliers that has supplied the company with some unique products. So we have to be very careful that the pressure we have seen from NGOs and some politicians to see transparency as a requirement under responsible business conduct, more as a naming who your suppliers is and are and their suppliers. That's not the notion of transparency that the guiding principles or the OECD guidelines put forward. The notion of transparency is that we should be able to account for our risks of adverse impacts, how we manage them, and how we measure effectiveness on that to each other in business relationships. So I think that's just to mention one of the key challenges we see with how the policies are being put forward, formulated now. One has to be very clear that a management system consists of two elements. You manage your own business and all your units internationally, and then you manage your business relationships. And the way you manage your business relationships is that you ask the business relationships to do the same as you do. And you enable collaboration between yourself and the business relationships by sharing that information. So it becomes a positive change going on with businesses all over the world, where we can assist each other in meeting the standard. And then we can reach the goal of the standard in a pragmatic manner. And the goal of the standard being scaling up respect for human rights, management of environment, and anti-corruption internationally.
And this is what we're trying to do with IMPA ACT as well. It's a partnership-based program. It has a collaborative approach. We have ship owners that partner with suppliers, and they work together and share best practice. And that will enable both of them to grow at the same time and walk the walk in time. So I think that's very well put. It's safe to say that we will see probably updates to the directive, and the directive as is.
Definitely, and also the narrative. I'm just pointing out some of the few challenges. Another challenge, and a big challenge, is of course how does the EU Commission intend to hold companies accountable? I mean, should they be fined if they do not have policy commitment, due diligence, access to remedy in place as a management system within their company? And how would the authorities then assess whether that is in place or not? And that comes back to our key challenge, with which IMPA ACT is also helping. How do we document due diligence? What is the minimum I can expect from a business relationship to have in place? Would be similar to what is the minimum that the EU Commission or the states within the EU could expect from businesses within their jurisdiction. But what does that look like in practice? So far, we have had a requirement on the directive on non-financial annual reporting from businesses, that they should actually report on their due diligence in their annual report. But it's very, very few companies that does that. And of course, that will not be enough to document due diligence. We need more thorough information, so I can look at my supplier and I can have a good feeling in my stomach that they are managing their risks well. In order to have that feeling in my stomach, so I can collaborate with the supplier, is that they are able to disclose to me what did they identify, where did they identify risks, what are they doing to prevent and mitigate those risks, and how do they measure effectiveness on that? How do they, on top of that, engage potentially impacted stakeholders in continuously improving those efforts? That's the information I would require to rest assured that the company does well.
I think particularly for this point, IMPA ACT is very, very helpful in that we have designed some amazing resources with you, Sune, and we have guidance for the companies who are assessing their impacts. And we're telling them how those impacts apply in practice and how they can assess them better and more efficiently. So it really is a program that can be undertaken in time by anyone, not only someone with CSR experience or vast sustainability knowledge. As long as you dedicate the time, you can do it. You can get there. It's really interesting that you're saying that the directive will definitely need more work, and that's definitely not a finalized form. There are certainly many questions out there. I know I recently talked to Anel from Thorsen, and she's been having so many questions regarding this. How exactly will it behave? What about the funding that they talk about at the end for the grants that they're talking about? And there are so many questions, but unfortunately, until we have a finalized version of the directive, I think they shall remain unanswered, because we don't know much.
A lot of guesses, yes. I think the basics are forming. I just think there are some key notions that need to be in place before the EU Commission finally decides on how this should look. I think it's one of the challenges we saw. There was actually a proposal in the Danish Parliament for the Parliament to consider some kind of legislation on mandatory due diligence, and then the proposal from a few parties within the Parliament contained two elements. First, mandatory due diligence, but then the second part of the proposal was legal liability for adverse impacts that you somehow are connected to in the world. I mean, liability, be it penal liability or civil liability in terms of paying damages. That second part can only, so to say, be implemented if we have agreement between many states to do that. So that could be part of the EU regulation. But mind you, it would require that all rules and procedures for these international claims are aligned within all EU jurisdictions. And today they differ completely. I mean, how do you pierce the corporate veil and so forth? So my suggestion or my proposal to the EU would of course be focus on mandatory due diligence, having the management system in place before you start introducing some kind of liability for adverse impacts that you're either causing or contributing to abroad, or that you're merely linked to, which is part of the proposals we have seen so far, because that will require much more preparation before we can start making international or EU regulation that would enable to hold companies liable extraterritorial for severe impacts on human rights and the environment.
I can definitely see a follow-up webinar or podcast perhaps impending with you on further developments on this. I'm sure everyone will have a lot of questions with further updates to this. And it's, as I said, it's a great thing, but it's also a very worrying thing for some companies.
Yeah, but that's why my back to your first statement, just start getting it done. I mean, start developing these processes, and then you are well ahead of the curve with businesses or in the community, but you will also have a legitimate voice when raising your concerns with the legislators, the regulators, that, well, going in that route would be impossible for businesses to meet if you start regulating in that direction. This is possible. This is what we can do. This is reasonable and pragmatic, and we do manage our risks of adverse impacts in a manner that should be appreciated as enough.
So don't wait until you're pushed.
Yeah, and then what we do with all the clients we work with is that we seek to hit the what is the absolute minimum you can be expected to be able to demonstrate as a company when meeting the due diligence requirements. So don't overdo it. Do it so say lean in a lean manner in your company. And our a few years back we started working with a capital fund, Polaris Private Equity, a Danish capital fund that buys up small, or not small, but medium-sized businesses and develop them and sell them again. And they started applying the standard squarely to all their investments. So first we screen the companies whether they have the management system in place. It's actually quite easy to screen whether a company meets the standard or not. So it's definitely also possible for a regulator to do that. Once you then take over the company, the capital fund, now the owner of the company, requires that the company implements the standard. And these are also not so big companies, but the interesting thing is they all get value from conducting due diligence. it brings them in, it gives them information on how the company is run, and it enables them to pinpoint the holes where they need to, or the gaps where they need to improve their actions. It also enables them to be part of the wider CSR sustainability agenda in a much more solid way than just picking a few low-hanging fruits.
I think this answers very well Scott's question in the chat. He asked earlier, are the members of IMPA ACT now seeing the strategic value in aligning their businesses with the UNGPs? And with the impending EU legislation, I would assume this value is now being manifested as their front runners in responsible business conduct. And I think what you've said so far responds to this quite well. Yeah, I think.
I hope that answered you, Scott.
I'm sure you have. I think the feedback that we got from our IMPA ACT members is generally that they're not super worried, which is, I think says everything. They're not super worried. We have everything in place. It's just we have to make sure that the structure is there, and we'll be good to go. So.
Yeah, and of course, it's also it is an interesting time for IMPA ACT as an initiative. Of course, the IMPA ACT is, of course, depending on its members. So the more members, the more assistance you will also be able to receive from the IMPA ACT, I would guess, in the future. And there are many better practices evolving that, of course, could be put into the IMPA ACT toolbox with time, now that we are coming close to regulation within the EU. That would, of course, also affect companies or ship owners globally, because they most of them will have some connection to the EU and would then be part of such regulation. Our experience is it's not that difficult. Just get to it. I mean, right now we've developed, since we worked with so many companies in implementing this standard, we developed a 5-day program where we have 2 participants from the company, so that they're not alone when implementing. And within 5 days, they get their policy commitment, they get their first operational level impact assessments on all 3 bottom lines, and they get their code of conduct for business relationships in place. In addition to the capacity development that these 2 people will experience, so that they can maintain and develop the program inside the company in years to come, and we are not needed any longer. So it's not a big effort. It's more a mindset, I would say, and then the right tools to assist them going forward. And IMPA ACT is perfectly situated to provide those tools for their members.
Can we dream just for a minute here and ask you whether you think we're in the early stages of seeing the UNGPs properly enacted globally? The way I see it, right? I'm dreaming here, but bear with me. The way I see it is that EU is a great sustainability leader, and it is very likely that this development, whenever it gets enacted, will push other countries into feeling the pressure of following suit. So, right, let's look very further into the future, far into the future.
I mean, this is I think it's not a momentary dream. It's the dream I had all along, that yes, this would scale up, and it makes so good sense. The guiding principles were, as I did mention, is an ingenious stroke, so to say, because they take away the corporate responsibility to respect human rights from whatever states do. So no matter what the state is doing and what they acceded to in terms of international human rights commitment, doesn't matter. Businesses have to conduct their human rights due diligence, and it makes a lot of sense, and it makes you improve the business. And yes, we may see EU as a region being the first regional initiative to impose regulation, but mind you, EU is half the size of China, and in China they are also discussing the implementation of the UN guiding principles because they have been the scapegoats for responsible business conduct for many, many years. And why is that? A Chinese business can, of course, also respect human rights very easily by implementing the management system and become good practice in implementing that management system. But and the Chinese government is indeed interested in ensuring that also, first of all, of course, state-owned enterprises in China will start implementing the minimum management system that they also acceded to and applauded when it came around in 2011. So I don't. Yes, I do see EU as a spearhead if the regulation comes about, and it will not become a so to say Eurocentric perspective that we put on this, that it's only companies outside the EU that need to conduct due diligence. So if that happens, then it can, of course, create a lot of companies that start doing the work, and the companies will push this. This is what we are. This is how we document due diligence, and this is how we start using that in our relationships with other businesses and with the regulators. And mind you, we are seeing other states around the world that are considering mandatory due diligence in Southern America and in the African. I mean, in Kenya, for example, the constitution have in it all international accepted human rights. So their constitution, the Kenyan constitution, is far better evolved than the Danish constitution that only have 9 human rights in it. So it's already becoming part of regulation in the various parts of the world. The Indian Corporate Act has for a long time required businesses to have management systems in place to manage their risks in relation to sustainability. Now, it's the same. It was due to the UN Guiding Principles in 2011 that Corporate Act was changed. Now it's much more about how Indian companies then do it and become able to demonstrate it. But I think we'll see these better practices come from all over, and of course regulation can push it. So it's not only the few front runners that does it properly, but that it will become the norm of business. It will be the element that provides the social license to operate in any jurisdiction in the world. And of course, that is not only my momentary dream. It's of course been the dream all along.
I think we're ending on a super positive note right now. I would absolutely love to stay here and pick your brains for the rest of the day if possible, but unfortunately the session is coming to an end. So I will probably, as we are approaching the finishing line, want to thank you for being here today with us and imparting some of your knowledge with us. It's been a really, really insightful talk, and I'm sure our attendees think the same. Scott has written just recently and said, brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting.
It's always a pleasure, and I hope everyone has had a nice session and had their questions answered. Sune unfortunately does not have a booth for this year's virtual event, but I'm sure he would be very happy if you could visit his website at globalcsr.net, and you can find there more about his consultancy experience, his e-learning tools, his new all-in-one due diligence tool, as well as the fantastic workshops that he's running. Stephen and I attended some of these in the past, and they were brilliant opportunities to learn about all things human rights in business through case studies and active engagement. As for IMPA ACT, you all know where to find us. We do have a virtual booth, so you can ask questions over there. Come to talk to the team, and of course, for more information, you can head over to impa-act.org to find out more. Many thanks to everyone again. Many thanks, Sune, and I guess I'll see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Ciao.
Jasmine. Yeah.